"I own it," he said, his voice calm, but every word slicing through the room like glass. At that moment, Arthur froze. The man they had erased from memory, Caleb Thorne, the scholarship kid they once scoffed at, now owned the mansion they were begging to rent. This isn't just a story about wealth. It's about memory, power, and who gets to rewrite the ending. So, before we dive deeper into this tale of quiet revenge and poetic justice, tell us, where are you tuning in from? Atlanta, New York, Dublin? Drop it in the comments. What do you think happens next when the boy they excluded becomes the one holding all the cards? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the tables turn in the most unexpected ways. Because today's story? It's about a man they erased, until he came back owning everything they once denied him. The upscale cafe in Midtown Atlanta buzzed with a low hum of polished laughter and the soft clinks of crystal. In a sunlit corner framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, 5 men gathered around a table that looked more like a boardroom than a casual brunch spot. Everything about them, from the designer watches to the effortless confidence, screamed curated success. At the center sat Arthur Caldwell, his silver hair impeccably styled, his posture commanding. He scrolled casually through his tablet, flicking away options with the disinterest of someone who had never heard the word compromise. "This reunion," Arthur began, not bothering to look up, "has to be more than a party. It has to be a statement." His tone wasn't open for debate. Around him, Brandon Lee, whose tailored suit hid a meticulously gym-toned physique, nodded. Scott Donahue, the real estate magnate who collected classic cars like trophies, murmured agreement. David Wynn, with his vaguely famous podcast, and Miles Renfro, the quiet shadow who still followed Arthur like an understudy, all sipped their drinks, pretending this was about nostalgia and not validation. Arthur finally set the tablet down, his platinum cufflink catching the light, a subtle reminder that some crowns never tarnish. "We're not planning a high school reunion. We're curating an experience. It has to be exclusive, breathtaking, unforgettable. It has to scream, 'Look at us now.'" No one questioned his phrasing, understanding he meant their inner circle, the ones who mattered then and still expected to matter now. "I've been scouting venues," Arthur continued, his voice smooth. "And I think we should set our sights higher. No country club nonsense. We need something rare. Something that whispers legacy and roars money." Scott leaned in, intrigued. "Like that estate in the hills with the private art gallery and the infinity pool?" Arthur gave a satisfied smile. "Exactly. The Onyx Haven. It's private, almost impossible to book, but I know someone who knows someone. It's not about affording it. It's about deserving it." The air thickened with a mixture of ambition and insecurity. That was Arthur's true gift, not just making others want what he had, but making them question if they were worthy of it too. "We want people to walk in and feel like they missed out on something grand just by not being us," he added. The goal wasn't just to host an event, it was to perform a success that felt unattainable to anyone else. As the conversation shifted toward artisanal cocktails and high-end catering, the guest list came into focus. Arthur reopened his tablet, reading names like they were assets. Each mention came with a commentary. "Marcus Langford, tech billionaire. Definitely. Julian Jennings has a startup now. Absolutely." The list was less about reconnecting and more about curating an audience. Then Miles, always the one to ask the offbeat question, tilted his head. "What about Caleb Thorne? He was in our class, right?" The question hovered like static. Arthur's finger froze mid-scroll. "Caleb Thorne?" he repeated, trying to place a forgotten bookmark. "Oh, right. The scholarship kid? The one who used to wear the same faded hoodie all year?" Scott raised an eyebrow. Brandon snorted softly into his drink. "I think he spent more time in the library than the gym," David offered. "Wasn't he the one who won some science thing senior year?" The tone wasn't admiration, but mild amusement, recalling a background character they'd already rewritten. Arthur gave a dismissive wave. "Honestly, I don't think he'd feel comfortable at the Onyx Haven. It's not his scene." And just like that, Caleb Thorne's name vanished, swept away not with malice, but with something colder, irrelevance. No one argued. No one asked where he was now. No one considered that years might have changed more than a wardrobe. To them, Caleb still existed in sepia, brilliant perhaps, but dimmed by social invisibility. They moved on, laughing louder now, basking in the certainty of their plans and the assumption that the world still worked in their favor. Outside, the Atlanta sun shimmered across the glass, the same way the past shimmered behind them, distorted, selective, self-serving. In their eyes, they had already won. They just needed the perfect stage to remind everyone else. What none of them knew, not yet, was that the stage had already been claimed, and the boy they had once erased was no longer waiting in the shadows. He owned the spotlight now. Arthur's search began with the same confidence that had carried him through every curated chapter of his adult life. With his iPad in hand and his espresso barely touched, he sat cross-legged in his home office, a room wrapped in steel and glass. Across his desk lay glossy brochures and printed email chains, each promising luxury. He believed all he had to do was choose. But this time, it was different. The first preferred venue was booked. The second came hours later, and the third, more formal, more final, slid into his inbox before he finished lunch. By the end of the next day, he'd received 5 rejections. His brow creased in a way it hadn't in years, an irritation that couldn't be massaged away by luxury treatments. He called in favors. He name-dropped. He even offered to pay double for peak weekend access, assuming money would do what charm could not. But the universe seemed, for the first time, unimpressed by his social resume. Brandon tried to soothe him, insisting the right place would appear. Scott offered the name of a golf club. Arthur's smile was tight. "I'm not planning a retirement banquet. This isn't just a gathering. It's the statement of the decade." To him, it was. This event wasn't about nostalgia. It was about staking their place atop a ladder they'd never admitted was still standing. That was when the assistant, young, nervous, and new, slid a printed flyer across Arthur's desk. "There's a property that's not listed publicly," he said carefully, "but I heard from a friend who catered there last month. It's called the Onyx Haven. Supposedly it's breathtaking." Arthur studied the image. A perfectly lit photograph of a modern coastal mansion perched above the ocean, all clean lines and dark glass, reflecting nothing but sky and power. He felt his heart shift. This wasn't just a venue. It was the venue. He typed the inquiry himself, discarding his usual assistant-forwarded approach. The reply came quickly, almost too quickly, with professional efficiency. "Thank you for your interest. The Onyx Haven is a private estate and available for select events. Weekend rates begin at $25,000. Additional fees may apply. Please note, all bookings must be approved by the owner." Arthur read it twice. The price thrilled him. High cost meant exclusivity. Select approval? That just added intrigue. He pictured it already, the 5 of them on the terrace, expensive whiskey glasses raised as the sun melted into the horizon, guests murmuring in awe, wondering how they pulled it off. When he shared the update in their group chat, the reactions were instant and effusive. Brandon sent clapping emojis. David texted, "That's exactly the energy we need." Scott replied with a photo of himself in a bespoke tux captioned, "Manifesting this backdrop?" Arthur smiled as he watched their excitement bloom, unaware that under the foundation of his plan, a fault line had already begun to form. They scheduled the site tour immediately. Brenda, the estate's property manager, was polite but formal on the phone, asking detailed questions about guest count and service. Arthur responded with practiced poise, listing luxury florists, celebrity DJs, and custom lighting designs. His tone floated just above condescension. He wanted Brenda to know they were not some desperate party planners. This was high society, resuming its rightful place. The morning of the tour, they dressed like men prepared to make a memory. Chic but casual, affluent but not loud. The drive up the coast was filled with laughter and speculation. Miles played soft jazz on the stereo while David practiced poses he would use by the pool. Scott whispered that he hoped the wine cellar was extensive. No one questioned whether they would get the property. The only question was which shade of elegance they'd paint onto it. As they approached the estate, the iron gates opened with hydraulic grace, revealing a manicured drive flanked by towering cypress trees. The house emerged like a vision. Dark stone, sharp corners, windows that didn't reflect the world but reframed it. Brenda greeted them at the front, clipboard in hand, her demeanor calm and efficient. "Welcome to the Onyx Haven," she said. "I'll be guiding you through the space. Please let me know if you have any specific requests for your event." They toured in hushed awe. Every room outdid the last. Custom woodwork, art that didn't scream wealth but murmured pedigree, a scent in the air that could only be described as expensive. Arthur said little, but his eyes missed nothing. When they reached the terrace and took in the panoramic view of the sea, he turned to Brenda and said, "We'd like to book it immediately. November weekend. Full buyout." Brenda gave a professional nod. "That date appears to be open, but final approval will need to come from the owner. I'll confirm with him directly this evening." Arthur smiled, pulling out his checkbook. "Perfect," he replied, pen poised over the line. "What's the owner's name, by the way?" Brenda glanced at her tablet, answering without a second thought. And that's when everything changed. "The owner," she said, "is Caleb Thorne." Arthur's pen froze mid-stroke, his hand suspended above the checkbook like a still frame. For a man who had never learned to hesitate, this pause was jarring. Brenda's voice had been perfectly neutral, but the words echoed far louder than their volume deserved. The same name that had been so casually erased from the reunion guest list now sat on the deed to the very estate they were desperate to claim. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick. Brandon's phone slipped slightly in his hand. David turned toward Arthur, waiting for a cue. Scott blinked twice, as though the name might change. Miles, ever the observer, said nothing, though his eyes never left Arthur's face. "Thorne?" Arthur finally asked, his voice lighter than usual, as if testing whether this was truly the same kid they had once relegated to the back row. Brenda, unfazed, nodded. "Yes, Caleb Thorne. He purchased the Onyx Haven several years ago. Very private, but he hosts a few events each year, strictly by request." The woman's tone was purely informative, completely unaware she had just detonated a social bomb. The group trailed behind Brenda through the rest of the estate, but the energy had shifted. The sweeping views no longer inspired wonder. They demanded explanation. The infinity pool, which just moments ago had promised envy and elegance, now shimmered with accusation. It was his. Caleb Thorne's, the kid who had eaten lunch alone while they planned prom themes. The kid whose science fair victory had been squeezed between announcements for football tryouts. The kid who had been deemed unworthy of an invitation was now the gatekeeper of their fantasy. The phone sat like a loaded gun on Arthur's marble counter, silent and immobile, yet radiating pressure. He had stared at it for the better part of an hour, his thumb hovering, retreating, hovering again. The estate's approval still hung in limbo, unspoken but implied. Every hour chipped away at his control. He wasn't used to waiting. He certainly wasn't used to needing anything from someone he hadn't deemed relevant in over a decade. But relevance, it turned out, had a cruel sense of timing. Caleb Thorne was no longer just a forgotten name. He was the one person Arthur couldn't move forward without. Finally, unable to bear the silence, Arthur dialed the number Brenda had provided. It rang twice, then once more, and then a voice answered, familiar in tone, but firmer, more composed. "Hello, this is Caleb." Arthur forced a brightness into his voice that tasted artificial. "Hi, Caleb. It's Arthur. Arthur Caldwell from high school. I'm not sure if you—" Caleb cut him off gently but unmistakably. "I remember." Those two words sliced through the room like a scalpel. Precise, calm, and impossible to ignore. Arthur hesitated, his smile faltering. "Wow, it's been so long, hasn't it?" he said, scrambling to reclaim control. I heard you own the Onyx Haven now. First of all, congratulations. The place is stunning. Truly, we just toured it the other day, and we fell in love with it. Caleb didn't interrupt, didn't offer pleasantries. He simply waited. Arthur continued, his words tumbling too quickly. The reason I'm calling is because we're organizing our high school reunion 13th anniversary. Can you believe it? And we thought the Onyx Haven would be the perfect venue. It's exactly the kind of atmosphere we want. Elegant, intimate, exclusive. He laughed lightly, though nothing was funny. We'd be honored to host it there, assuming you're open to that sort of thing. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to signal that Caleb wasn't rushing to make this easy. Your reunion, Caleb repeated, as though tasting the phrase. And who exactly is included in we? Arthur rattled off a few names, carefully avoiding the guest list Caleb had been pointedly excluded from. Just the usual crowd, he said, breezy but brittle. A few of us stayed in touch over the years. You know how it goes. Caleb's tone was neutral, but layered like stone, polished to a dangerous smoothness. That sounds like a lovely group. The last word landed with the weight of a verdict. Arthur's throat tightened. He could hear it now. The very thing Caleb wasn't saying. He knew. He knew he hadn't been invited, and he knew the offer only came because they'd stumbled into his empire. Arthur pivoted, quick as ever. Of course, the list is flexible, he said with an airy tone, even though his palms had gone cold. We'd love for you to come too. I mean, we should have reached out earlier. Things just got so hectic. You know how it is. But Caleb didn't answer the lie. He let it sit there. I'll think about it, Caleb said at last. Thank you for reaching out. His voice was perfectly even, so professional it hurt. I'll get back to you. And then he hung up. No dramatic ending, just silence. Arthur stared at the screen, his reflection dim in the black glass. He had walked into the conversation assuming he still held some version of the crown. But now he wasn't sure he'd even been in the same room as the throne. 3 long, brittle days passed. The silence wasn't just an absence. It was strategic, measured, suffocating. Caleb Thorne hadn't replied to the call, the message, or the polite follow-up email Arthur had sent. The clock was ticking louder each day, and the Onyx Haven, his pièce de résistance, was still out of reach. What made it worse was the nature of the silence. It felt deliberate, like a held breath. Caleb refused to release until he chose the exact moment to exhale. That knowledge stung more than Arthur wanted to admit. When the call finally came, it was in the evening. Arthur recognized the number immediately and stood from his chair as if posture could influence the outcome. He answered with a voice too bright, too prepared. Caleb, hi. Thank you so much for getting back to me. There was a pause, not awkward, but intentional. Caleb's voice, when it came, was soft and steady. I've given your request a lot of thought. Arthur nodded reflexively. Of course, I know it's a big ask, and we appreciate your consideration. Truly. Caleb continued, his tone unfazed. I understand the significance of your event. I'm sure it means a great deal to you and your friends. Arthur held his breath. There was something about the way Caleb said your friends that made his stomach twist. Caleb paused, then delivered the blow as gently and precisely as a scalpel. Unfortunately, the estate won't be available for your reunion. I've decided to keep that weekend reserved for time with my wife and family. It was polite, impeccably worded, unarguable. But beneath the elegance, the message was unmistakable. You don't belong here. Not in this house. Not in my life. Not anymore. Arthur's lips parted, then closed. Oh, I mean, we could be flexible with the dates if another weekend is better. That's not a problem at all. I'm afraid not, Caleb said calmly. November is reserved for personal use. I won't be opening the estate for events during that time. There was no anger, no smugness, just a door closing. Quietly, permanently. I wish you all the best with your reunion, Caleb added, with sincerity so measured it felt almost surgical. I'm sure it'll be memorable. The call ended not with a bang, but with a click so soft it sounded like silk being folded. Arthur stood in the middle of his kitchen, phone still in hand, the room suddenly colder. His empire hadn't crumbled, but something had cracked. Something invisible, internal, and essential. Later that night, he told the group the estate was booked out, spinning the excuse with a shrug and a strained smile. They groaned, pouted, and offered backup suggestions with the kind of casual privilege that came from never wondering if a door was closed because of who you were. Only Miles watched Arthur a second too long, as if he saw the truth underneath the explanation. But Miles, as always, said nothing. They settled on a high-end hotel ballroom downtown, refined, expensive, and utterly forgettable. The kind of place where events were photographed but never remembered. The reunion would go on, the outfits would sparkle, the drinks would flow, and the photos would be posted. But the shimmer would be synthetic, and somewhere deep down, Arthur knew it. The show would continue, but the spotlight had shifted. It wasn't his anymore. Meanwhile, across town, the terrace at the Onyx Haven was bathed in lavender dusk. Caleb stood barefoot, a linen wrap thrown over his shoulders, a glass of wine resting lightly in his hand. His wife, Sophia, sat nearby, flipping through a leather-bound book of poetry, her reading interrupted only by the low hum of the sea. There was no music, no speeches, just peace, just distance, just the life Caleb had built on his terms. He had thought about the reunion only once since declining the invitation. Not with bitterness or satisfaction, but with clarity. It wasn't the rejection that mattered. It was the principle. He had risen not to prove anything, but because he refused to be measured by a scale he hadn't helped create. The country club ballroom gleamed with polished chandeliers and rented ambition. The welcome sign read, 13th Anniversary Reunion, Class of Northwood High. But the letters looked tired. Outside, valet attendants yawned between Teslas and Bentleys. Inside, the music was too loud to talk and too forgettable to dance. Guests mingled under the soft clink of stemware and small talk. Everything looked right, but it all felt flat, hollow. Arthur stood near the entrance, forcing a smile that had lost its edge hours ago. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. This wasn't what had been promised. The event Arthur had once declared would be the talk of the year had become just another high society gathering, attractive but disposable. The absence of the Onyx Haven loomed like a ghost. No one dared bring up Caleb Thorne directly, but his name had taken root in the unspoken. It threaded through every glance Arthur cast at the doorway, every glance he caught in the mirror. The man they'd excluded without hesitation now haunted the event like the shadow of the better version it could have been. Not because he had said no, but because his no had reshaped everything. Still unwilling to admit defeat, the group tried one final move, hosting a charity gala, something high-profile meant to remind the city who still held social clout. They secured a top-floor venue, a luxury florist, and a Michelin star chef. Invitations went out to all the right names. But on the morning of the event, the sky cracked open with rain. The elevator system failed, and half the vendors arrived late. Guests whispered about the chaos. But what turned heads was who didn't show up. Caleb. Not only had he been invited this time, but his RSVP had come with polite ambiguity. "I'll see if I can make it." He didn't make it. He didn't need to. His absence was the loudest thing in the room. Because while they clinked glasses and forced laughs under flickering light fixtures, Caleb had been photographed across town at a tech summit, seated on a panel between CEOs and investors, speaking about global equity and innovation. The image went viral by that evening. His poised silhouette against a backdrop of real influence told a story no party or Instagram post could compete with. The comments weren't just admiration, they were alignment. People wanted to know him, follow him, be him. And suddenly it became clear. No gala, no social spin, no guest list could rewrite what had already been rewritten. Caleb Thorne wasn't part of their world anymore. He had become the world they wanted to be part of. That night, as Arthur scrolled through Caleb's growing press mentions, his hand clenched around his glass just a little too tightly. The others were quiet in the group chat. No new photos, no recap threads, just a shared, unspoken understanding. They had tried to remind Caleb who he used to be, but all they'd done was remind themselves of who they no longer were. And Caleb, he didn't lift a finger. He didn't need to. The reunion ended not with a bang, but with a quiet exit. Guests left in waves, careful not to be the last to leave something they no longer believed was impressive. The photos would be posted, the captions glowing. But beneath them, a different story would whisper. A story of a man once erased who now wrote his narrative from a home no one thought he could own. And Arthur? He went home, poured another glass of whiskey, and told himself it had all gone according to plan. But late into the night, he would scroll through his phone and stop at the photo, the only one not taken that evening. The photo of the Onyx Haven, taken on the day of the tour. Sunlight streaming through dark glass walls. His hand paused above the checkbook that would never be signed. That moment, frozen in time, was his true memory of the reunion. Not a toast, not a suit, not a dance, just a name spoken once and never forgotten again. Because the price of overlooking someone isn't always guilt. Sometimes it's simply being left out of the life they built without you.